It's the spookiest time of year, and you know what that means. It's time to talk about the scariest monster of them all, Ghost. He's your beloved monster back from the grave, here to haunt you with magic tricks.
Illusion, Michael.
Turns out he's not happy with you forcing him to train every week of his life. And while Chris Angel may be unintentionally horrifying, our boy Ghost really isn't. So to keep things in the spirit of the season, we'll be adding in a few frights throughout the episode to keep an even keel. Don't worry though, just keep an eye out for the spooky meter, which will fill up over time as the spine-chilling spooks approach. Ghost is actually the first monster I ever won a competitive tournament with. My little Hatso was the talk of the community for a bit, and that's thanks to Ghost not being the type of monster who, wins tournaments. In this sense, he fits the archetype perfectly because just like real magicians, it's hard to take him seriously most of the time. The thing about video games though is that they don't always have to be serious, and a lot of the time they're at their best when they're not. But even though Ghost is the closest thing Monster Hunter 2 has to a joke character, he can still put the fear of Monster God into his opponents, as long as he keeps a few tricks up his sleeve. Ghost is the spirit of a monster who has died and has the attributes to match. He's hard to hit and he can spook you good with some high damage coming off of a good intelligence stat, and he's got the second best guts regeneration in the game. But it's not really enough to make up for his non-corporeal physical stats. He's got minimum life, power, and defense gains which can hurt him badly. Luckily, these stats don't matter too much in the context of competitive, but Ghost can be a tricky monster to raise in casual play. Just relying on speed isn't often enough to beat the whole game. If your goal is to win without getting hit, the odds of that happening decrease the longer the match lasts. It's in your best interest to drop a nuke to end things as quickly as possible, and that's Ghost's real weakness, but we'll get into that in boo time. Ghost's basics are pretty awful, but looking at them you wouldn't expect much anyway, so I guess it works out. Toy Hammer has a huge windup for abysmal hit chance and damage, tanked even further by his high guts tier making his accuracy and his damage lower on average. Though if viewed through the lens of Ghost being an unserious monster, then maybe it's the most thematically perfect tech, because it's a joke. Charge is also an exceptionally bad tech, but it has a unique use case that we haven't actually talked about much in the series so far. Obviously, if you're using an intelligence-based Ghost, you wouldn't want to swing a 9-force power tech. But if you're stuck in the first slot, Charge might just be your ticket to victory. We talk a lot about animation time being a defining factor in a tech's utility, but there's another parameter that doesn't show up on the stat screen that's worth considering, and that's how the tech moves the monster within the arena. So, spoilers for the eventual Arrowhead video, but one of the most deadly moves in the heavyweight format is Arrowhead's Claw Assault. And that's not directly because of how good of a move Claw Assault is numerically. Like, it's a fine tech, but what makes it scary is that landing a Claw Assault pushes Arrowhead back just enough for it to immediately follow up with Hidden Sting. The damage output of these two techs back to back is often enough to KO most heavyweight opponents not running tank builds. And Ghost's Charge is not that. But it does push Ghost well outside of slot 1 on a miss, meaning its best use case on intelligence builds is to whiff and end up in slot 2. Ironically, it would probably prefer Toy Hammer's awful -5 hit to take advantage of this utility. And a strange thing about Ghost is that he has no other power techs that aren't special techs, and no special techs that aren't power techs. It doesn't make sense when you take his stat gains into consideration, but it makes a lot of sense when you take the funniness of the whole thing into consideration. For Uppercut, Ghost beefs up and delivers a haymaker, but the issue with haymakers is that if you don't drive them from your legs, you don't end up with much force behind them. And Ghost has been skipping leg day. The numbers aren't great, but there's actually a really fucked up thing to consider here, and it's how good this tech is on tank builds versus other tanks. Now that doesn't really seem to track at first glance because you're spending a ton of guts for a move that doesn't actually do a lot of damage, and that's the antithesis of what makes a good anti-tank tech. But Ghost has an absurd guts rate, and in anger 50 guts becomes, well, I wouldn't say it's a negligible cost, but it's an acceptable amount to spend to keep an advantage going. It's very easy to look at this tech and think it's horrendously bad because of how much it costs and how little it does, but the +1 hit and withering make it usable, especially considering that since you only have techs in one slot on power builds, you've got a ton of opportunities to build up guts. It's not great, but it at least works in niche situations. And combination is more of the same, marginally more expensive for a bump to force and withering. Combination ends up working almost exactly like its prerequisite. You'll almost always end up getting both because it cuts Ghost's chance of using its basics down to 50% from 75%. The 55 guts cost is a bit easier to swallow when you consider it existing at all means that Ghost may not use Toy Hammer in Charge. Ghost is a predominantly intelligence monster though, and as such has way more green techs to talk about than yellow ones. Energy Shot is a very accurate tech that does no damage. That's not a unique archetype, but what makes it special is that it also does no withering. 16 cost might as well be nothing for a Ghost, but a 5-second animation time means that this tech often puts Ghost really far behind when he uses it. It's only really useful to run the clock with a lead as the end of the game approaches. Necromancy is notable for being the most accurate tech in the entire game. It's also notable that despite this, it doesn't actually see much play. You can run a minus skill build with Necromancy and Energy Shot that'll stay consistent regardless, but the problem is that even with maxed out intelligence, the move still struggles to advance the game state in Ghost's favor. Necromancy doesn't add any force to Energy Shot, so you're really just paying for that hit percent. Despite all of its downsides, Necromancy is one of the absolute best options in the game to secure the win after your opponent grits, or versus extremely low life nuke builds. Surprise is a withering tech that withers for more than it costs on a very fast guts rate monster. If you remember back to the plant video, you might recall how broken of a concept this is. But the real surprise here is that Tecmo managed to make this tech suck. Much like Plant got the nerf hammer in the transition from Monster Rancher 1 to 2, Ghost boarded the struggle bus to Garbage Town. Ghost was an exceptionally strong monster in Monster Rancher 1 for all the same reasons as Plant with human control, and he would have been completely detrimental to the gameplay experience in 2 if he wasn't dealt with. Surprise becomes a very risky move on -10 hit and no real supplemental damage to make it worth swinging. And since Ghost's fast guts rate punishes it through guts correction, often making it even less accurate on average than other monsters, you'll often have about a 1 in 3 chance to land this move. At that point, it becomes a situation of needing to drastically outperform these odds to get any real value. Again, versus tanks, this move has a niche, but if your opponent also has a fast guts rate, you'll just proc their anger and then all of a sudden you've made the matchup 10 times harder for yourself. It also shaves 6 seconds off the clock, so just like his hit techs, more often than not the best utility for this is just a timer scam. Astonishment is actually the most powerful intelligence attack we've talked about damage-wise so far, which is really funny. It's also probably the only one of those techs that's worth using more often than not. It's still not good, but the potential 41 guts drain is a great burst option and makes retaliation very difficult. You'll still need another tech to finish off your opponent though, as 11 force will absolutely not be cutting it. So I guess it's time to call in the air support. Dove Bomb is a relatively cheap and low damage heavy tech made difficult to use with its -17% hit. Usually quicker animation time wise than any of the other techs we've talked about so far, Dove Bomb is often best used with a huge gut surplus rolled down multiple times, hoping you land 1 or 2. You're gonna miss this tech way more often than you'll hit with it, but you're pretty starved for options. Pigeon Bomb ups the damage and cost significantly, but everything else stays the same. A marginally better force for guts ratio makes this tech feel better than its prereq most of the time, but it's still pretty bad. This is Ghost's best option versus tanks 99% of the time, regardless of all the other niche stuff I mentioned for the other techs till this point. Ghost's final 2 moves are sharp techs, and you know how we feel about sharp techs most of the time. Magic Card is such a monumentally bad technique that it's hard to talk about in a vacuum. It's a sharp tech with bad hit and 11 force, meaning that the whole point of the critical hit percent is wasted on an attack that does no damage. A 50% boost to nothing is still nothing. Magic Card exists not really as a tech, but as a lesson in how context changes how good or bad a tech really is beyond just its value parameters. Plant's Seed Gun looks numerically very similar at first. It costs a similar amount, does a similar amount of damage, animation time is similar, but Plant can use Seed Gun in conjunction with Lifesteal to keep a life lead over its opponent, and Ghost has no other reliable high damage option to play a similar game. It also has significantly worse hit, and a half second of animation time adds up as Ghost tends to chain magic cards together, whereas Seed Gun pushes Plant out of slot 4, allowing it to recoup some guts. And fittingly, Magic Cards is like a crappier version of Plant's Seed Gatling. Cards actually sees a lot of play because it's Ghost's most consistent source of damage on the intelligence side, but on most other monsters this tech wouldn't even be in consideration. It's pretty standard as far as mediocre sharp techs are concerned, good value when it procs a crit, and it's overpriced otherwise. It's a middling tech in a sea of abysmal ones, so on that merit alone, it's his go-to. So how do you build Ghost? I don't know, man, things are pretty grim. Ghost tends to do best in formats where his opponents can't run speed effectively, or he can hope to cash in on a gimmick of some kind. Ghost is pretty self-explanatory, but Intelligence Ghost gets murky because all of his options fill a role, they're just bad at the role they fill. If you're running Energy Shot and Necromancy, you're probably doing so on a build with less skill than normal to boost your Ghost defenses, or you're going all in versus extremely low life builds. But this Ghost doesn't really benefit from Anger because these attacks take forever to animate and do no withering, nor does it often benefit from Power because, well, I mean, if you got higher defenses, you probably won't be knocked into low health as easily. If you're running Astonishment, you're doing so just as a lockout strategy, so you need Anger to function. But the problem with Necromancy and Astonishment is that they both completely lose as soon as you fall behind and need to make up a deficit, meaning that Magic Cards and at least Dove Bomb become your necessary pickups regardless of strategy, and the latter becomes a liability in minus skill builds more often than not. Ghost doesn't actually mix with any other monsters, so the strongest Ghost is just Ghost. There's a Ghost that spawns with a 6 guts rate and DX, but it doesn't have access to grit, so it becomes a choice. Run the 7 guts rate Ghost if you think getting KO'd is a real possibility, and the 6 guts rate Ghost otherwise. It may not seem like a big difference, but the jump from 7 to 6 is the biggest 1-point jump in value that's possible in Monster Rancher 2. Often you just blanket run Anger over Power, it helps with the critical hit rate on Magic Cards, and, you know, turning that 6 guts rate into a 4 is just obscene. And that's about all there is to Ghost. He's really crappy, but you know, he's cute and he's got a fun hat. Whether intentionally or not, he ends up being Monster Rancher 2's joke monster, but I mean, at least he's better than Mochi. Thanks for watching. October is swamped, and I'm streaming nearly every day this month with Ultra Kaiju Monster Rancher and more tournaments over on twitch.tv/moosebones. Thanks to my Patreons for making this series possible. If you'd like to support and see a little monster run across the stream beside your name, look at that, look how cute they are, then check me out at patreon.com/moosebones. I post updates and works in progress and all that fun stuff, and the Patreons are always the first to know what's going on. So until the next one, hope you have a spooky rest of the month.
Any questions?